I'll be lucky if anyone watches this video through, but TLDR, ReZero sucks and Log Horizon is the best isekai anime ever, period. For a while, the true villain of Log Horizon was tax evasion, which is ironic considering most of the story's Daisuke Uzumu rides have revolved around history and economics. Suffice to say, Log Horizon is an isekai anime and a light novel, but it's one I genuinely love because I'm one of those dinosaurs who very much likes conflicts around drama instead of fisticuffs, and fights should be a last resort. But this story isn't afraid of its own death, not being god-smashingly asinine and callously contrived like most and hundreds of counterpart isekai stories trying to sort itself out, while everything else decides to be morbidly embarrassing, showcasing dismal efforts. Log Horizon remains unappreciated for what it is, pretty awesome, therefore making it the greatest isekai since No Game No Life, Konosuba, Cautious Hero, and Yojo Senki, considering I can recount those anime even being me walking drunk. But even for me, it's hard for me to imagine that I'll ever be eclipsed, considering most anime studios are adapting every body of the Barrel series till the online publishing form's tap runs out. I'll admit Log Horizon isn't an anime with problems in some areas, but what I will say is that these problems are tolerable in my opinion, not being pathetic, frail, and cheap. Now, it's true that isekai means teleported to another world or another world, with the primary objective of the main character being to get home, with no shortage of narrative or thematic reasons to set the precedence over its protagonist's desires with whatever which fulfillment the author wants to write about, because they're writing escapist literature, which tends to lean more towards less story and more living out one's polluted fantasies, with some characters ranging from untethered sexual fantasies to characters with messiah complexes, with the sun revolving around this one character's shenanigans and hijinks that I don't like. But immediately off the tip of the bat, what I especially like about Log Horizon is that real-world knowledge translates into in-game knowledge, and certain characters' expertise in fields of study such as engineering, economics, cooking, architecture, or other STEM professions just so happens to be the most useful knowledge or power in this alternate setting. Considering the base foundation of the game with its fantasy setting and magic elevates the Dr. Stone-like aspects that might arise from living in a game world similar to World of Warcraft with a moving economy, thereby allowing the intellectual players who take the game personally and seriously enough with backgrounds in STEM to not only dominate the game world, becoming well-regarded leaders and or MVP players, able to overcome their social ineptitude and inadequacies they most likely had in base reality, and use those set abilities to obtain a reality and status they've earned for themselves with the use of their confidence and knowledge. Not only does Log Horizon have the credentials of a story of this caliber, but it's the ensemble cast of characters that are memorable and are equally likable and fleshed out, which is rare for any anime in general to be doing, which just puts a stupidly big Glasgow smile across my face. But discussing the first genuine arc of this series up until the title drop, the series begins with an all signs that would normally cause me concern, and avoid the series like the plague and swing it away with a tennis racket. That's showcasing the core concept or appeal of Log Horizon, which is basically No Game on Life on steroids and surrounded by meth and crocodile fortress of nerds and their love of video games and technology. But despite this game being full of antisocial characters, Log Horizon is a social drama that happens to take place in an MMORPG. Unlike Overlord, most of this show consists of conversations about how to build and maintain a society worth living in inside of this nightmare video game world they used to inhabit but has drastically changed. With video game logic that becomes real world logic at the drop of a dime, but with some caveats being that players can't die, being effectively immortal, but the NPCs aren't, with the downside being every time a player dies, they lose their memories of the real world, thus in turn bringing about a metaphorical death by example of don't let your memories kill you. However, at this point in the story, nobody was aware of this fact, but we're aware of the respawn effect, therefore as a viewer, we're wondering why is the story gallivanting such a high energy action scene if the show doesn't want to enthusiastically pander this out throughout the remainder of season 1's 24 episodes? Well, because of course it does. It's somehow the animation needed to capture the ever-demanding attention of the mind-numbingly short attention span of teenagers. This is the way. Nonetheless, was this a wrong decision to make? I don't know, and I absolutely don't care, but accounting for the fact that I was one of those dead-brain teenagers, I'm not one to judge. Considering in either case, albeit your first viewing of the series or a repeat watching, now that I'm a veteran anime watcher, I can assuredly tell if an anime will be bad from the first minute to the anime opening, spoiling the entire plot. Now then, more than before, I hold an anime's first minute and opening to more scrutiny conflicting considering now I have less time to watch anime because I don't do YouTube as a full-time job. Hell, I don't even remember the last time I received a YouTube paycheck since the algorithm changed. Anyway, less than a minute into a show and we see a character named Shiroe opening up a user interface, thus confirming we're in some kind of video game world and not can you pick up girls in a dungeon, featuring a video game-like mechanics in a non-video game-like world. But the question becomes, considering these characters know they are immortal, why are they running in fear, terror, anger, and seem disorientated? The answer to that is though they are in a game world, they do experience pain and misery alongside the fact that their bodies are lopsided from the transmogrification from the real world to this game world. Considering having all this MMORPG user interface information on our side of the screen makes sense, whereas seeing it in reality coming out of your eye sockets would be absolutely nauseating. That's why they're disorientated. Most importantly, the story establishes that this is so much information overload, you couldn't make any sense out of any of this bullshit on screen unless you paused and took the time to read it all, which Shiroe obviously can't do mid-combat. Therefore, it presents to us, the viewer, in a moderately engaging way, it's a problem. And these stats in World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV Online-like systems become a core part of the narrative, because it literally holds value, which we'll find out later with how fights are done in this series. With all the stat numbers you see on screen mattering and not being inconsequential or tacked onto the story for no reason, with most of these player stats being used as a handicap within the series to explain how the main characters can be defeated in certain scenarios being used strategically. And though most would assume that the level cap in this game is level 90, it's not, it's level 100, and Shiroe is getting his pancakes battered by these low level monsters because he can barely take in what's happening. Engaging from the appearance of his attire, it's more of a support character than a mainline balls to the wall combat mage in the front lines, which is more amplified by the fact that his attack was more of an environmental tactical move than something you'd say a sacrifice Pokemon would do, knowing that in this battle this certain character can't win but can be useful in more ways than one, such as lowering its stats and or boosting your other party members. Speaking of party members, we're introduced to both Akatsuki and, for lack of the better words, our Eugene, aka Naotsugu, but we'll refer to him as Eugene because he's a representation of most perverts and degenerates subscribed to this channel without having a hard R rating featured in most hentai. With Akatsuki being my favorite character, with her being Batman-esque levels of serious, melancholic with Red Hood levels of rash, and her being a ninja, it's just too great to pass her up for being tier 1 level waifu material in this series. Anyhow, it's beyond obvious that Eugene is a tank, Shiroe is this archmage, and Akatsuki is an assassin that are all level 90, all experienced players, and are all losing because the controls suck and they aren't just playing a game through a monitor screen. It's their new reality. It's not Sword Art Online, which was designed to be character trapped in a game built out of a MMO mechanics. This is again a show about an MMORPG akin to Blade and Soul, World of Warcraft, Terra, Black Desert, and Genshin Impact coming to life with these rules being warped into their new reality and rules they aren't used to, and their struggles against these enemies show that. This is a perfect example of showing and not telling. There's a sense of mystery featuring a bent of pandering action that if you got the attention span of a balloon will intrigue you in the first minute. Cutting to the OP. I distinctly remember singing the Log Horizon opening with my friend while in our corner off the edge of the cafeteria, and everyone was looking at us thinking there's something wrong with us. So of course Log Horizon opening is my favorite, and like much of what you'll see in the early parts of the 24 episode season, all the visuals and lyrics make sense the more you coast through the remainder of the show and get towards the end, thereby giving you slight teasers of what's to come instead of spoiling the whole goddamn show like most trailers these days, leaving you curious about what's going on in these scenes instead of vomiting the entire show onto the viewers. But to avoid spoilers and the emotional highs and the emotional lows of the series, the bombastic revelations and epicness of some, I won't be talking about any of it at all. But what I can say is, once we cross every moment or every revelation that the opening shows, it's a very satisfying recap and sensational viewing from my point of view of just watching it over again to enjoy it. At the start of the anime, characters are all taken to this world suddenly with no explanation. Unlike Sword Art Online, where players willfully went into a death trap by putting a microwave on their heads, or any other isekai with a character getting hit by a truck, these characters are utterly oblivious to why and how they're in this world. In the story, it's revealed that a spell named World Diffraction was used in-game, which in turn affected the real world and transfragified these characters into the game, but more on my theories later why this happened. But initially, there is no semblance of any kind of society, pre-existing or otherwise, when they get teleported into Elder Tale world, besides a large number of players relying callously and behaving on their own personalities and whims, leaving our main characters feeling ostracized as he searches for whatever friends he has in this strange new world. Now, it's important to know that Shiroe isn't a very outgoing person. However, it's through his skills and knowledge that he eventually learns and develops friends through his skills and knowledge. However, hypocritical to that, the reason why he refuses to join a guild or join a party was because people kept asking him for his help in game before this was their new reality, which could be annoying, especially when everyone else is incompetent or doesn't know how to play the game, which is why I'm also a solo player. Anyhow, how could someone like Shiroe join a guild, let alone build a society? In any case, in terms of Japanese social norms, it trends to fall in line and not stand out, contributing to society with familiar responsibilities taking a front seat, whereas American values, individualism, and freedoms take precedence over those latter things the Japanese care about. Suffice to say, where self-interest is the norm in America, in Japan the norm is building each other up and not dicking people down and screwing them over. So again, how does Shiroe overcome his shortcomings with someone from his past, of course? That person being named Kanami, as she is a whimsical person dragging people wherever she wanted to go, and for Shiroe, she was the right kind of extroversion to whip his ass into action despite her not being there in-game at this point in the story. And with him watching other people existentially suffer with existence with nothing to live for, why not only think about fixing a world where he can just begin to do it himself using leverage from getting him from point A to point B? But I'm getting too ahead of myself. For people to want to form a culture or a society, other humans will need to actively form groups and then have those discourse meet and form communities, which then create societies. But understanding the narrative flow of things throughout the starting points of the show and what they inevitably unfold into, how can I best tell you these beginning portions of the anime that are fundamental to the latter despite how cliche it is, which most shows in this genre would be tempted to put on a puppet show at the moment when the characters first appear, forcing them to recall knowledge they should already know to other players who should already know these things for the sake of the audience, which they don't, meaning I respect the hell out of this show a lot more for not establishing the world outside of the game before we're introduced to the story, reversing stories of the real world for more character intrigue to the world they come from, not leading to the idea that they're trapped in game, but moving right away into the narrative of helping players and one another and discovering the nature of the world. Now, I'll save the discussion of whether or not these threads of explanations that are gathered if they are interesting to the narrative later, but at the start of the show, of course, everyone is confused, much like how we all be if we were there or put in their situation like this. People are killing themselves and acting like assholes, but this is all regulated to the background, which I'm perfectly fine with. Anyone could have predicted things would unfold this way, and while it's important to at least acknowledge that these reactions are happening, we don't need to regurgitate Sword Art Online, .hack, and ashes and illusions. But the most intriguing things that the following scenes do is focus on a character yelling at an NPC demanding to talk with the game master, which I don't understand why he'd do that, but considering that if this was a game, these characters would be pre-scripted, act a certain way, and not be fully autonomous AI, made me come to the conclusion that the now NPCs were effectively people, meaning that they are autonomous AI now, and they recognize themselves as people, which on my initial viewing was confirmed in a later arc and the subsequent episodes. Believe it or not, despite this initial arc setup being generic setup, it features a wealth of subtle foreshadowing for moments which won't mean anything to anyone at first, but eventually will be played out later or recontextualized in a different way later, whether you remember them or not, but the story will remind you that this did indeed happen. For example, a bit later in the story, a character named Nanta discovers the reason why food doesn't taste like anything is because it's made within the game's systems. But the main team of Log Horizon discovers that salt and natural grown food taste like normal food, which leads to the discovery that food tastes like normal food if they make food outside the game's systems, i.e. cook or creating the food themselves, which ultimately leads to Shiroe creating a new form of magic that affects, well, everything that these characters know. But again, at risk of getting ahead of myself, I'll not discuss this right now and talk about it later. Skipping to the next sequence where Shiroe pulls out his user interface and opens up his friends list at the top of the list, we can see members who are listed as offline, which in actuality they are located on another server because currently at this time, it's impossible to switch servers. It's explained in the series that each region of Elder Tale is an exact fantasy recreation of every continent, meaning that Japan maps looks like Japan in continent shape, whereas China map looks like China. But why? We don't know yet, but it intrigues me. It will make sense for a game to have dedicated servers for each region, but considering it's a game world that features telepathy, does this mean that this is somehow some kind of failure in communication, or is it not in range? I don't know. We don't know. The story doesn't want to tell us, but Toya and Minami are here too with no surprise before we have any reason to know who these characters are. But they're not cardboard cutouts and are engaging characters with three-dimensional edges of intrigue that'll make you bleed if you poke them. And given the entire cast of characters are made up of nerds and weeboos, that's mighty impressive considering the emotionless black hole most isekais use to detach its main protagonist from the main reality that exists. Sporting a character that prefers the fantasy world over the real world, it makes these characters more interesting considering the game world itself is Dr. Stone's version of our reality, meaning that yes, this is a fantasy world, but this is a fantasy world that doesn't come with an instruction manual or a fantasy world where you are handed everything with a silver spoon in every player's mouth and a platter, meaning that even these characters have to work and have some level of grounded perspective to the world around them and the tasks they must do to complete a day-by-day experience. In other words, get by and enjoy the work they do to contribute to society. Even though that society in a fictitious fictional world, it's still work, and work is work either way you cut it, and work must be done to uphold the society. But meeting up with Eugene, they go on about how Shiroe figuratively looks like how he exactly imagined he would, but then again Eugene looks like nothing like a typical hentai PogChamp after a brisky conversation. But first and foremost, most of all, I appreciate that this story chooses to focus on a group of experienced players who knew one another and the game like the back of their hands from the get-go of the story, as opposed to pairing these characters up with someone like a noob to the game, like many stories likely do, thereby allowing the stories to focus on the changes between the game and this reality instead of how the mechanics of this world works. Now this does something important for the episodes, which pulls these characters away from the crowds for a moment so that when they do return to those crowds, they're moved past from their reactions of being trapped in this world and accept things and begin to ask questions about how this all works, now applying theory from prior knowledge. Now this is where things get a bit confusing. Shiroe explained or established that his body height differs to his real body, didn't convert to his avatar's bodies. And Akatsuki, when she's first introduced as a completely different gender than what she is in the real world, is indifferent with her petite body type, with the implication that the characters' real faces and bodies haven't been transposed onto their avatars' bodies, which is counterintuitive to what was said by Eugene just moments ago. But this will be proven untrue when later we see their real faces and memories and they're the exact same as their avatars, seeming more likely that this dialogue is in reference to much more abstract visuals of the original visual of the game before they were all isekai'd into it compared to what it looks like now in this new reality. But again, this wasn't the game they originally played, this is a new reality, a world where creativity and personalities run amok, creating an open world sandbox in accordance to the will and personal needs and ideology are the front of people's minds instead of ethics. Considering it only costs about 3 battles a day to survive in this world, discounting the fact that every player currently logged into this game aren't new players but people who have played the game before, therefore having items and cash pre-apocalypse, like their griffin summoning whistles from Shiroe's magic bag to Shiroe's appearance changing potions when Shiroe confirms he has access to his items, until the rather serious tone of the series gets neutered by Eugene as he categorizes all men as 2 types of perverts, just like Eugene always does. This kind of sexual harassments are pivotal comedy scenes in this show, as Akatsuki in juxtaposition from Eugene's, Eugeneness stops him from being a, pervert. To be completely honest, I'd be surprised if anyone found any of these jokes particularly funny at all, but Redo of a Healer and the hero extermination with darkness exists, and I certainly laughed during all those sex, murder, and death that occurred in that, so I don't find any of these jokes in Logs Horizon particularly funny, but you know, whatever floats your comedic boat, I guess. But I don't watch watch Log Horizon for comedy. I'd watch Sekitaki Yakidomo for that, given I think these scenes are primarily used to subside the expositional and heavily layered dialogue from melding together from scene to scene. Considering this show uses comedy and action as a means of breaking up conversations, which is pretty clear during the Eastal and training arcs, which is far better than showing fan service, which I'm proud to say doesn't exist in this show, with a core narrative focusing on social politics. But moving away from that, this is where Akatsuki changes her appearance, which brings me to the worrying conclusion that there is some player somewhere trapped in a body that they may have not preferred or never preferred, and considering sometimes I choose avatars which are not of my gender and appeal, what the hell are they doing right about now, considering that these appearance changing potions are apparently rare items? Now, discussing the change of Akatsuki's appearance only because she's tier 1 waifu material, of course, I definitely prefer this appearance over her look in season 2, considering she's more exotic fantasy ninja-esque feel, swifter than water running down a stream than battle-hardened warrior samurai ninja that appears in season 2. Considering she's a petite female assassin with purple eyes and long hair that she ties up in a ponytail, comparing that to the later attire to the old, wearing a sleeveless purple top, purple arm warmers, brown pants, and purple boots, against her clothing being similar to those ones, albeit refitting to match her new stature. It's just an outfit that sneezes glitter from my point of view, but if her interpretation of an fantasy ninja is this attire, I'm perfectly fine with that. I'm okay with that. Yes, I am. Especially with the show's running gag of Akatsuki kneeing Eugene every time he makes a perverted joke, but I'd like to say that's more related to her personality than the show just being the show, considering nobody else calls out Eugene on his perverted antics besides Akatsuki. Speaking of, Akatsuki's ninja gender reveal is revealed at this point that she swears her fealty towards Shiroe, which she's never really breaks character throughout the entire series, being an absolute zealot in role-playing, with a variety of facial expressions and outfits that are featured prominently throughout the series, as if role-playing was just a part of her identity, which would lead to future romantic interests that'll be completely neglected by the main character because he's too busy working by the end of the season. But for now, they form a party with Eugene when they arrive at the Crescent Move Alliance Guild Hall, and a huge realistic portrait of a dog showcased overlooking the mantle of teddy bears is shown to the viewer, which is kind of creepy. This is the introduction of Marielle, a stereotypical overly woman-like personality who's the leader of the Crescent Moon Alliance, being both hyperactive and expressive just as she's fun and obnoxious. At her introduction, then, she's in the latter half of the series as their character develops, expanding what these characters will amount to against whatever existence you imagine them to be. If you ever imagined anyone playing a video game that was of the female gender, this is what this character is. Someone that does things and enjoys doing things for the sake of doing them. This is someone who's more of a casual player, who enjoys the more social aspects and casuality of MMORPGs instead of the more competitive scene. You know, friends you can chill out with. That's what Marie is. It's around this time when it's revealed that Shiroe is a master tactician and strategist, a part of a group of players named the Debauchery Tea Party, who's completed the game's best and most difficult challenges, and it's been nameless for most of its existence because Konami, the group's leader, didn't find it important to give themselves a name, as they were friends having fun. But because someone insisted that they needed a proper name, they eventually adopted the Debauchery Tea Party name, debauchery jesting of Konami's wild tendency, while Tea Party referring to a mad tea party from Alice in Wonderland. This group ultimately disbanded because of several personal reasons, leading to the indefinite hiatus of the group after a trip to Europe that resulted in Konami getting married, which she then chose to retire from the game and move to Europe for her studies, while Eugene had a busy work schedule causing him to quit. Whereas Indicus was also obsessed with making the Tea Party the strongest group of the Yamato server, he ultimately fell into a violent mood swing, which prompted two members of the party, with one of them being named KR, to quietly encourage the remaining members to leave the party, which resulted in a few casual players not knowing much about them, whereas malicious rumors spread by smaller guilds even gave rise to the belief that their accomplishments were just a hoax, making them legends. Anyway, with the first episode of Log Horizon wrapped up with its accuracy to MMORPGs, with an enigmatic villain that's done this to these characters for no reason, unlike a certain other character in Sword Art Online that was so disassociated with reality he created his own world and ruled it like a god, to be dethroned by some 15-year-old transcended computer code person, which still doesn't make any sense now that I have a bachelor's degree in computer science. Let's move on to episode 2. But moving on to episode 2, we start off with a windbreaker, with this part of the video discussing ReZero versus Log Horizon. And even despite me making a video about why ReZero hasn't aged well with time, ultimately I can say why in this video and have another anime to compare it to. Even despite all of its gawkiness and all of its gruesome death, which ultimately resulted in returning to his normal self, Log Horizon ultimately presents a situation where you can die in a definite amount of times like ReZero, but have your personality solely slowly deteriorate, and worse than that, you slowly forget who you are and begin to remember things but forget a portion of those things you remember, resulting in you potentially becoming a different person. If you die too many times versus ReZero, where Subaru is a character that dies a numerous amount of times and his personality doesn't change much but in the Elseworld stories. This is my main gripe with ReZero. The second season magnifies the problem with the series overall, revealing that none of the situations Subaru dies in are of his doing. It's the writer trapping the character in a situation where he constantly loses because that's what the story demands, until the ex machina that gets the main character out of this situation gets introduced into the story, because of course it does, versus Log Horizon, which presents a character that are not only competent but took time to learn the mechanics of this world, and despite having prior knowledge of the world before the apocalypse. It's proven time and time again that characters are willing to learn from their mistakes and gain that knowledge on their own merit without being told to or being put in a situation that results in either life or death. But then again, the motivations of the characters of Log Horizon aren't trying to protect the girl for a thinly lined reason that can be barely explained and cluttered with unnecessary violence. Subaru's character remains static, learning nothing from being in a fantasy world, equating to anything that can be useful in combat situations like, I don't know, support magic or any kind of alchemy or trapping skill or something. He's barely even a hand-to-hand combatant, being 90 pounds wet. You think surviving starvation, witnessing his friends getting gutted alive, suicide, and many more horrific events would gold him into really learning something to defend himself and others, like Kaneki from Tokyo Ghoul, but he doesn't. And I emphasize on these ReZero Elseworld stories because I find them more entertaining than the actual series, despite them being about the character of Subaru being pushed to ad nauseum and having his character being completely out of sync with his main continuity personality, and the supporting cast is way more entertaining. Either way, the reason why I find Log Horizon more appealing than ReZero is because ReZero is a balloon-breasted bimbo, whereas Log Horizon is a beautifully written love letter to something like World of Warcraft or Dungeons & Dragons. Ultimately, when you play your first video game, or your first open world video game, say GTA 5, sure, you feel kinda bad when you kill the civilians, but over time, you grow desensitized to it. It's the same with ReZero. At first, Subaru's death were traumatizing to watch, but over time, these deaths became more annoying than anything else that elevates a story, or at least to anything interesting. Whereas in Log Horizon, when the first death rolls around, it's pretty important to the overarching plot and narrative, and it does elevate the story, and like in Dark Souls, they slowly lose their humanity. And I'm bringing this up here because a player does die in the coming episodes, with those said episodes never obfuscating any information, with every scene establishing something new without delay, and doesn't focus on something random like some girl unwabbing her panties. Not batting an eye to revealing things, raising questions, and having those said questions answered later using inferences and common sense, whetting the appetite of some episodes as build up to later episodes. This is one of these episodes. When Log Horizon's characters die, they return by death at the cathedral at the hub city of a region when they die in battle, telling us there's a bonfire center akin to Firelink Shrine and the Grand Exchange from RuneScape, which will lead into an important revelation later. But considering ReZero's death is nigh-existent, the existential question that must be asked in this series is, how can you make life meaningful in this again Dr. Stone-like setting for these characters, which the main antagonist of this arc embodies? By catching up with our main party, they're adventuring in old but new territory. Considering Elder Tale is one of those MMORPGs you could play for months and still not have experienced all of what the game has to offer, and they're re-experiencing it to see if the game's the same again, hanging by their Achilles tendon, which are hung by so many moving parts that complement with one another but become rather confusing at times. I didn't have to have this information repeated to me because I already understood it from the get-go, but that can't be said for first-time viewers. But considering how we learn as the characters are learning, this allows viewers to discover information with these characters, which we see them apply later within the story, which can be helpful. But considering this is my third time watching this anime, I already understand everything. But speaking of information, I haven't said much about the mechanics of the characters in this MMORPG world, but there's 12 main classes split into 4 groups: Warrior, Weapon Attack, Recovery, Magic Attack. These 4 types roughly correlate to the tank, damage per second, and healer roles common in most MMORPGs. But in Elder Tale, the DPS roles are split into 2 groups that differentiate between physical and magical damage. Each class type contains 3 classes. The available classes may vary depending on the server localized classes. The classes introduced on the Yamato server, which the story currently resides, is the main setting of the story. The main classes are Guardian, Samurai, Monk, Assassin, Swashbuckler, Bard, Clerk, Druid, Kagane, Sorcerer, Summoner, and Enchanter. But in addition to that, characters in Elder Tale can have one of over 90 different subclasses, which can either provide bonuses for players or simply serve as role-playing tools. While classes cannot be changed after being chosen, subclasses do not have the restriction, making it possible for players to change their subclasses. Experience points for subclasses are independent of those of the major classes subclasses and are relatively easy to acquire. Subclasses during the game era were divided into 3 types: production, role-playing, and titles, which were acquired by approaching an NPC with a subclass changing quest. Some subclasses don't require further action and can be acquired immediately, while some others require leveling another subclass first or completing a series of quests. While only one subclass can be used at a time, most previous subclass experience points and skills will simply be overwritten and can be switched back with the appropriate quest. An exception is made for particularly special, difficult to acquire, or event-related subclasses. Those require a subclass removal quest that erases all EXP and skills attained from them before the player can switch to a new subclass. While adventurers are limited to having 12 main classes, people of Earth are capable of having player subclasses serve as their primary occupation. Some subclasses are found only on Earthlings, where later some Earthlings only occupations as player subclasses. After the apocalypse, due to the dangers of hunting and fighting with one's own body rather than controlling a character from a computer, many players switched over from combat to crafting subclasses. This is in turn has made collecting ingredients that much harder. Later on, subclasses were discovered to have a more potential than their previous game counterparts, such as chefs being able to create food with real flavor. As a result, overskills began to develop, allowing magic and objects not native to Elder Tale to be created. Suffice to say, Log Horizon does have a lot of depth to its systems, but it's a system that allows for both realism and a bit of imagination, allowing players a bit of improvisation when it comes to how to use the game system to make life easier. The ins and outs how these systems work become directly important as the show enters its second arc, but it's dished out gradually over the show. But to hang this out, Akatsuki mentions how her favorite goblins are the ones that wear the skulls on their head because they're cute, and I think that's cute, so I'm mentioning it here because waifu tier 1. Anyhow, because power loves a vacuum, everyone is buying up all the guild halls, with a player killing situation ever evolving within the story, which they are attacked. And let me tell you, I've always been a fan of tactical combat scenes in anime, which I'm overly entertained by. Then establishes our hero's first quest, a rescue mission to pick up a member of the Crescent Moon Guild from the northern town of Susuno, which has fallen under the domain of a violent ruler who happens to be a real player or adventurer. Episode 3 and 4 are quite linear and less dense than the first two. They follow straightforward plots that are straight as a sword. First and foremost, a character named Nante is introduced, and according to the Log Horizon popularity polls, this character is fairly popular and rather liked and synonymous with most viewers. But guess what? Not with me. I mean, as a character, he's genuinely wholesome with his attentions, and like Akatsuki, he assumes a role-playing persona with an elder tale and speaks in honorifics, being calm and reliable, and the very definition of a cool cat, rarely ever being surprised by anything, almost like he's a gentleman, but he's a middle-aged man in his 40s. The next character that's introduced is Sarah. She's meek, naive, easily flustered, and super cliche, and she remains that way. The only thing interesting about this character is that she is so bored out of her mind with this game that she leveled her maid subclass by 3 levels since the apocalypse began, and she's swirling around in the den of human traffickers that are exploding NPCs. Yeah, that's the actual plot in this story. We'll later see something like this to better effect by the end of the season when Nuraha subjugates the west of Japan and pretty much takes over it, becoming the Furher. But that's way down the pipeline. Anywho, with the core cast characters now traversing through a cave system to get to the city of Susuno, where they are placed between a rock and a hard place, having to sneak around the city, considering the resulting deaths of any of the players in the core cast would send them back to their spawn point. Interestingly enough, the characters are able to communicate through a telepathic voice messaging system, and though the antagonists own the guild hall, they're able to circumvent it by traveling to a dead zone, which is located in a cave, because they can't simply meet these two characters in the opening due to the very fact that every player is tracked by the guild hall. Following this, the core cast of characters come into conflict with the main antagonist, and yeah, it's an awesome fight scene with lots of tactical choices and scenarios, but I think you'd be better watching it yourself than hearing me explain and talk about it. Then following this, Shiroe establishes Log Horizon and decides he's going to become the villain in the glasses to make the world a better place. Overall, what is established is something we already know. The characters are good working with one another, and that's about it. But until next time, which will be, yeah, we'll talk about characters next time, if there ever is one.